Hey everybody, how's everyone doing tonight on this fabulous Sunday? Welcome back to another exciting episode where we talk about theology, philosophy, and tonight we are doing a special episode on Leibniz cosmological proof for the existence of God. I made a special presentation, so I hope you guys enjoy that. My voice is feeling a little bit tight. So forgive me if I trip over my words or anything like that. Hopefully the contents of what I'm saying rings out, can stand on by itself. So forgive me again if I trip over my words. It's good to see everyone. Good to see Dumb Trick. Good to see Right Wing Rice. Hope everyone's doing great tonight. It's good to be back. I'm sorry about the psychedelic stream. I was kind of a disappointment, but I'm working on setting up a part 2, so that'll be fun. This is probably going to be the last week. This is some housekeeping information I just got to get out there. This may be the last week I'll be able to stream like every day. I might have some family coming in September. And then I also have school starting soon. I know most of you guys who are young also have school starting as well. But I will definitely be doing an episode every Sunday. That is one thing that I can guarantee. So the Sunday episode will be here to stay. So always look forward to that. And yes, it's going to be, for now, unless someone like says that 8 p.m. works better for them. I think 9 p.m. PST is going to be like the standard time. But let me know if there's another time that works better. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you so much, Dumb Trick and Orange, for the lemons. Appreciate it. Yeah, time to vibe, guys. But very optical sticker from Flamenco. That's the Hego face. That's awesome. That's a great reminder on this Sunday, this fabulous day. In any case, I think that will just jump right in. Forgive me if I miss any of your super chats. I might just like go into the zone and just be talking about philosophy. This is going to be a little bit more intense episode, so save your questions till the end. That way, in case like you say your question, I just happen to miss it. You don't like feel bad or anything. Please don't feel bad or anything. It wasn't intentional, but yeah, save the questions till the end. If you have questions about the terminology I'm using or anything of that nature, but The title of the episode is "You're Not a Dummy for Believing in God." Some of the smartest people in Western civilization had proofs for the existence of God, and they weren't just contextualized. It wasn't like they just lived in a time period where everyone believed in God, but rather it is that God was a important and pivotal part in their overall philosophy, and they understood that. And we'll get right into that. So yeah, we're talking about Leibniz cosmological proof of the existence of God. So introduction here. Basically, I'm going to be presenting an argument for a necessarily existing being, and it's just going to be on the basis of the fact that any contingent concrete things exist whatsoever. And I'm trying to present an argument that is more reasonable than not that God exists, that the epistemic probability is higher that God exists. Of course, nothing can be known, I think, for certain. There might be like some parts that you would say like, oh, it's possible that some X, Y, or Z. But I think that in terms of the epistemic probability, it definitely favors the existence of God here. And so what definition of God am I using? Let me just make sure my camera isn't in the way too much. Alright, it cuts off a little bit. Words, forgive that. I made the presentation without thinking about the fact that my camera would be on. But in any case, the definition of God is going to be a necessary being who all of reality depends on, who is simple, and we'll get into what that means. Immaterial, eternal, has an intellect, and is the metaphysically greatest possible being. Again, we'll get into what that all entails. And so let's just jump right into the argument, schematized, and then we'll kind of motivate the premises one by one. So the contingency argument, there's a lot of text on the screen here. Apologize for that. You can see most of the argument. All right, cool. Otherwise, I would just minimize my camera. But it looks like you can see most of them. So let's just go through this. Premise one. There must be a sufficient reason, or what you could say a rational basis, for why something exists rather than nothing. And this premise relies on what's called the principle of sufficient reason, and I will back this up, motivate that premise after we get through this argument here. But for now, let's just take that argument as we're just kind of looking at the validity here. We'll talk about the soundness. So validity is just that the premises work together in a deductive form in order so that the conclusion actually follows. We'll talk about the soundness and when the premises actually hold water in a minute. But so there has to be some rational basis for why something exists rather than nothing. I think we all agree that something does exist. This is something, it exists. It could not exist. This whole universe is something. It could not exist. Very well. Another possible world. Premise two. This sufficient reason cannot be found in any single thing, or in the whole aggregate of things, or in the efficient causes of all things. So the sufficient reason is not going to be found in any single thing of why that this whole universe exists instead of not existing. It can't be found in the aggregate of things, as I say, in the totality, or if you quantify over the entire universe, either extended spatially or temporally, forward in time, backwards in time, or what you even call the efficient causes, which is like the most immediate cause. So if you just like trace back all the causes, you can't find a single reason why there's something instead of nothing. Excuse me, let me just get this water real quick. Like I said, my throat's been a little parched today. The world is then these are like the subpoints here. Things in the world are contingent, and we'll kind of explain what that is in a very simple sense. People who maybe are more philosophically inclined, there is a lot more to get into there. There's a lot of philosophical debate, but I'll give like kind of a simple definition of that. That is determined in their being by other things, such that if matter and motion were changed, they would not exist. In other words, and this is probably the easiest way to think about it, in some other possible world, this is a way that we talk about contingent and necessary. If in some other possible world, it is the case that it could not obtain. So it is possible that in some other world, this pen doesn't exist. That would be like something that's contingent here. The world is simply the conglomeration of such things, you just adding up all these contingent things. And thus it is itself contingent. Seems to make sense. The efficient causes of all things are simply prior states of the world. Again, efficient causes is just the most immediate cause. It's just simply prior states in this like linear regress here. And these successive states do not explain why there are any states. It doesn't explain why this state exists or any world at all. And I want to just start off by crediting William Lane Craig. He's the one who schematized this. I did most of the work with another guy named Guardian Acumen. He used to help out our account a lot. Not so much anymore, but I probably should have said that in the beginning. But yes, William Lane Craig helped to schematize this. I'll be helping to motivate the premises, though. All right, premise 3. Therefore, there must exist something outside this world, or the world being like the universe of material reality, and the states of the world, some sufficient reason for the existence of the world. And the sufficient reason would be a metaphysically necessary being, a being that would have to exist in all possible worlds, basically. That is a being whose sufficient reason for existence is self-contained. And we'll get into why the reason has to be self-contained and what that means. Only God, of course, is going to be some extra-mundane being, that is to say he's outside the world, and he can self-explanatorily justify his own existence. God's essence includes existence. It contains it. And we'll get into why theologians have thought this. And he is a necessary being who all reality depends on. So, of course, it makes sense that God is the one who's going to fit this bill here. We basically have some being or something that is going to be metaphysically necessary, and it's going to have certain traits. And the only thing that fits into this container, basically, the rubric that we set up here, is God. God, it matches this. So what we are talking about here is God, the classical and the theologically most, I guess you could say, used version of God. The one that Christians talk about, the one that Muslims and Jews talk about. So, and we'll, again, like I said, we're going to get into a lot of these things here. All right, so now let's start just talking about each premise one by one. So motivating premise 1. So the first premise, of course, why is there something rather than nothing? There must be some sufficient reason for that. It relies on what's called the principle of sufficient reason, which says that every concrete, or a concrete, by that we mean a causally efficacious, so something that has like some materially efficacious existing occurrence, object, or a relation between objects, has some explanation for why it obtains. Obtains meaning that it comes about, it is actualized, basically. So there has to be some explanation for that. And in order to lend support for this opening premise, I'll propose 2 lines of defense. And the first will maintain that the principle is a simple inductive generalization from apparent instances of explanation. And the second is that it provides a relatively simple explanation of why there isn't unpredictable chaos all the time. So for my supporting reason number 1, the principle is a simple inductive generalization from apparent instances of explanation. In light of the fact that explanations are part of our ordinary experience, insofar as that if lightning strikes, no one assumes that it's like a brute fact, that there is no explanation behind it. If there's an earthquake, no one says, oh yeah, I'm sure that was just a random event, there's no reason for why that happened. No, the first thing we ask, of course, is why did this occur? What is the cause behind this? There has to be something that is intelligible about this. There's some intelligible nature to the universe that seems to just be presupposed in all of science and philosophy. It seems to contain this principle. And so it may be reasonable to generalize from these apparent instances that seem to surround our life of explanations. After all, we don't see like all these unexplained things popping in and out of reality. We don't see these ad hoc just pens just bursting into reality ex nihilo. This is not something that's a regular occurrence on any of our inductive intuition would tell us that is going to happen. Therefore, we might generalize that for any X that just happens to exist, i.e. they do not exist of necessity, there's some causal explanation for their existence. Alright, so then supporting reason number 2. The principle provides a relatively simple explanation of why there isn't unpredictable chaos all the time. And for kind of using the way I'm going to try to justify this is basically through a reductio ad absurdum. If you assume that there can exist some proposition or some effect which lacks an explanation, you lose faith or trust in everything offered in science and philosophy. If there can exist ad hoc brute facts, then there is no reason to trust even the explanation behind our perceptions. And of course, the explanation behind my perceptions right now, my 5 senses, sight, taste, touch, etc., etc., is our sensory cortex. And so radical skepticism seems to be the result of saying that, okay, maybe there's these ad hoc brute facts. Well, then it seems I can't even trust, that is to say, I can't even be assured that there is an explanation for why I'm experiencing anything whatsoever. There might be no reason at all for having these perceptual experiences that I have, that you have, that anyone has. And you can't even say fortiori. That is to say that we can't say it's like more probable than not that we can trust our senses. And this is something that I think Edward Fazer did a really good job explaining. He says that the probabilities depend on the objective tendency of things, but if the principle of sufficient reason is false, then events we perceive could have no connection whatsoever to objective reality, including any pattern of the world. And thus, we would have to doubt even the probabilistic certainty of experiences. So again, probability depends on the objective tendency of things, but if the PSR is false, it could very well be the case there is no objective tendency of things. And finally, and this is probably like the most powerful part of the argument here, that even if you accept, like you just bite the bullet, accept radical skepticism, you're basically accepting a proposition. And so whenever we accept any proposition, we assume that there's a good reason to accept some proposition P. We assume that, the explanation behind accepting some proposition P is this reason. We assume that the explanation behind why, and let's say I say, okay, fine, I'm a radical skeptic, I reject the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, well then you would say that the reason why you accept the principle of sufficient reason, why you reject the principle of sufficient reason, why you hold to that proposition, is because there would be some explanation behind what you just said there. And that is the reason why you hold to it, is that you think it's more reasonable or whatever, or you think it's more logically valid. However, if we deny the PSR, just like in totality, we can't even trust our beliefs are rationally justified. There could be no explanation at all. You might think there's an explanation, but it's very possible that it's just this ad hoc thing that you've just come to accept this. And that what you're telling yourself is, in fact, just an illusion or something of that nature. So there seem to be some epistemic problems in asserting anything, and so you're basically reduced to absolute absurdity by rejecting the principle of sufficient reason. And what makes the principle of sufficient reason interesting, and more so than like other cosmological arguments that you may have heard of, that say like everything has a cause, or everything that begins to exist has a cause, like the Kalam cosmological argument, is that we're not saying anything about cause and effect, so we're talking about explanations. There has to be some reason, when there has to be something that's intelligible about what's going on here. And that will come in handy when we ask about questions about, oh, why can't there just be an infinite regress of causes? So basically, yeah, so this is the case for why we should accept the principle of sufficient reason. If we do accept the principle of sufficient reason, which seems to me it's a very reasonable principle, and if we don't want to be reduced to absurdity or into being basically we have to forfeit all our knowledge, then we should ask why there is a sufficient reason for why something exists rather than nothing. Seems to follow. All right, so motivating premise 2. All right, so for clarity's sake, this premise is essentially saying that the total state of affairs of existing contingent things cannot be completely accounted for apart from the causal activity of one or more non-contingent things, i.e. a necessarily existing thing. Basically, if you have contingent things, there has to be a necessary existing thing at the end of this chain, or whatever you would say. And so basically, let me explain what a contingent explanation is here. And a contingent explanation would be that the explanation would be external to it. So, for example, the reason why my dresser is brown is because of its creation process, the way the wood it was created with, the materials it was made of, etc. I'm not sure, dressers are made, but the way they furnish the wood and whatnot, that's why the dresser is brown. But nothing in the concept dresser explains why it's brown. If you think about the concept dresser is just like a piece of furniture that would hold like clothes or things of that sort. So it doesn't nothing in the concept dresser explains why it's brown, so it's a contingent, meaning it requires an external explanation. Another way to think of contingent, like I mentioned earlier, is that it could be different, or could not obtain in another possible world. We can imagine there's some other possible world where my dresser is black. We could easily imagine, without any logical contradiction, some other possible world where dresser is blue, etc., etc. Now, something is necessary is if the explanation is self-explanatory. That is to say, it's internal to the concept. The predicate is contained within the subject. That is what we mean by a necessary explanation. And let me give you an example of a necessary explanation here. That is something that's non-concrete. It's something that is rather abstract here. That a triangle has 3 sides. This statement is tautological or tautological. The concept of triangle, of course, by definition, a triangle has to internally contain the concept 3 sides, so it explains itself. The reason why you say, oh, why does a triangle have 3 sides? Well, that's just the definition of a triangle. Like I said, it's self-contained. And so in every possible world that exists a triangle, there has to be a triangle with 3 sides. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a triangle. If there's a triangle, then by definition, it would have to have 3 sides. So that way, in every single possible world, a triangle would have to have 3 sides. It is logically impossible for there to exist a triangle without 3 sides in the concept triangle. So hopefully that makes sense about what I mean by contingent and necessary. And so now with that in mind, let's take, we're talking about again the dresser. If we take everything which exists and everything which existed and everything which will exist, including any causally efficacious properties like natural laws as a singularity, we just quantify over all of these things, which are not just like the dresser, which we know is contingent, but everything. The process that made the dresser, all the natural laws that made the universe, everything like that. You'll not find in any of these causal relations or in the totality of nature an explanation for why this like singularity, this zone we've quantified over, why this exists instead of some other possible world. Again, by possible world, I mean like some hypothetical or different universe, basically. Some other possible world. There's no logical contradiction in asserting that things could have been very different. There's no logical contradiction in saying that the laws of nature could be very different, that our very existence could be and changed even very slightly. And it's even logically conceivable that nothing would exist whatsoever. There's no logical contradiction in asserting something like that. And so, yeah, it can be, like I said, it's very possible that there could be different laws, different chains of events, which is perfectly conceivable. In fact, we cannot find in any individual things, or even in the entire collection of series of things, and this is like an actual quote from Leibniz here, a sufficient reason for why they exist instead of do not exist. And so, therefore, there must be some sufficient reason for why they exist, and the sufficient reason is not contained in any of the concepts that we find in the material reality, so they must be outside this world, and that being, or there's some necessary thing that is extramundane. I'll get to this, why I believe it's going to be God, but it's going to have to be something that its concept contains the idea of existence, basically. It can self-explanatorily explain its own existence. So let's just talk about a quick objection here that I'm sure almost everyone who's ever launched this argument has ever heard of, and that is the infinite regress objection. Why can't there just be an infinite regress of causes, or this chain that just goes on forever? There is no explanation. The explanation just goes on forever and ever and ever. And this is what Leibniz said, and I think he just brilliantly lays this out. So I didn't even try to make this in my own words. I'll just say what Leibniz said here. He writes this, if you're curious, and on the origination of things, on the ultimate origination of things. You can find it. It's like one of his essays. You can find it online for free if you're interested in just finding his complete argument here. You have to read a few other of his works as well to kind of understand what he means by contingent. I'm trying to remember, and you can check my Instagram. I have like 3 parts where I kind of explain Leibniz, cosmogony, his ontology, and his views on essence. And in there, I reference the parts Leibniz talks about here. In any case, Leibniz says, sorry, I need some more water. Leibniz says, quote, "I certainly grant that you can imagine that the world is eternal." So Leibniz says, fine, unless you're saying that the world is eternal, the universe went on forever, and that there is an infinite chain of efficient causes. However, since you assume only a succession of states, and since no reason for the world can be found in any of them whatsoever, it is obvious that this reason must be found elsewhere. And so he illustrates what he's saying here. It might sound like he's just like repeating what basically repeating what I've been saying. But he illustrates what he's talking about here brilliantly with this analogy of the production of geometry textbooks, which are copied each one from a previous edition, extended indefinitely into the past. So imagine if you have a geometry textbook, and the reason why you have this geometry textbook is because there was some previous geometry textbook that they copied it from, and there was another one before that, and before that, and before that, and even if such a linear chain can exist, the regress will never contain a complete explanation, since according to Leibniz, since we can always wonder why there have always been such books, why they were written, and why they were written the way they were. So even if you have this chain of books being copied one from the other, there is not a complete explanation here for this chain. And likewise, even if there exists an endless regress of causal connections, there still must exist an explanation of why the chain exists the way it does. Why is there an infinite regress, basically? Why something exists instead of nothing. So again, you still have something, you still have a chain. So why this chain, or why a chain instead of nothing at all? Why a infinite regressive chain instead of a finite regressive chain? And finally, why this chain exists with the particular concepts and relations and natural laws which compose it, instead of some different assortment of possible concepts and relations. Like I said, there's no logical contradiction in assuming that there would be different natural laws in a different universe. There's nothing that says that the explanation here, there's no explanation basically for the existence of these natural laws contained within the natural law themselves. Alright, so then there's this question about what is the gap problem? And basically, a lot of philosophers, they hear this, people like Graham Oppy, they say, fine, I'll grant you that there is something that has to be necessarily existing, but I don't believe that it has to be like God. And so this is where we now have to talk about the attributes of God and how this necessary existing thing, which is extramundane, is God in fact. And so we'll be talking about some of the attributes of God, like his being eternal, immaterial, his personhood, that is to say he's rational, he's perfect and simple. And for the first three, it just follows necessarily from him being necessary. For the last two, him being perfect and simple, these are things that have been asserted in theology, and they match up with our concept of who this necessary being has to be. All right. Let me just jump right into this. How are you guys doing so far? Hopefully you're staying, following along. You're doing good. But I'll check in at the end if you have any questions. I hope if you don't watch the whole thing, then maybe go back and watch since the beginning. It's gonna be a densely packed episode. Excuse me. All right, so after having concluded that there is a necessarily existing thing or being, let's just call it a being for now, upon further examination, we can suggest that the traditional concepts typically ascribed to God are equally present in the necessary existing being, bound in the conclusion of our arguments. So this necessary being must be eternal. A reason to think that this necessary being is eternal is as follows. And this is something that the philosopher Joshua Rasmussen said. And if something is eternal, it never started to exist, and it will never cease to exist. If something starts to exist or ceases to exist, then its non-existence is still possible. Therefore, if something's non-existence is not possible, then that thing never started to exist. It will never cease to exist. Therefore, the necessary's non-existence is not possible. Therefore, the necessary being is eternal. And basically what it's saying there, that if we think about existence simpliciter, if at this very moment in time, this pen, let's just say it's the necessary being, doesn't exist. I'm using this pen a lot tonight, but let's say it doesn't exist, then you could say that it is the case that there's some possible world where the pen doesn't exist. Now, God has to exist in every possible world. And to exist simpliciter means he would have to exist in a presentist framework at all possible times, meaning that it would have to be eternal. That's what seems to follow from this. But again, this would presuppose a certain view of time called presentism. We'll get into what that is and how it differentiates itself from eternalism, and why you should reject eternalism for presentism. But this is so this part like is kind of non-controversial. The question is about the nature of time. So this is something that might be difficult to wrap your mind around for people who are not used to philosophy. But one of the ways to think about existence is existence at the current moment. If something exists, that means it exists in the present. If it existed in the past, that means it has existed. And if it exists in the future, it will exist. And so if I say that something exists, if God exists in all possible worlds, then they must exist in all possible worlds at all possible times in order to assert this. So again, eternal. All right, now the necessary being should be immaterial. Now if everything physical that we see around us is made of like these subatomic particles or energy, so energy, matter, and since we know that energy and matter is contingent, there is no concept within energy that would explain why this energy has to exist instead of cease to existing. There's no concept within matter, the subatomic particles, why these particles must exist. It's very possible that in some other possible world they don't exist. So they're all contingent, and so if all of matter and energy composes the entire universe and they're all contingent, then the necessary being will not be composed, it seems, of energy or matter. It seems to be immaterial. All right, the necessary being must have personhood. And this is something that Leibniz talked about as well. So if the necessary being lacked the capacity to choose non-necessary things from an assortment of all possible predicates, then the effects of the necessary being would flow deterministically from the necessary being like a logic problem. And this is something that basically Spinoza believed in, which would entail that everything is necessary. So if you have like a logic problem, and if you have certain like premises that are necessary, and you have another premises, and then you have the conclusion, and they work together through some inductive rule, modus ponens, or something of that sort, then we can say that the conclusion is also necessary. So if there's a necessary being, and he has no free will, he has no ability just to choose between an assortment of predicates, then every decision that the necessary being makes is just going to be a necessary, and so there's this like you might call like a modal collapse in which everything is therefore going to be necessary, everything is going to be a logic problem, i.e. everything's negation would have to imply a logical contradiction. But that's not the case. Everything is not necessary. As we know, all of these things that we see around us are contingent, which means that this necessary being had to have free choice, it had to have a volition, a will, and therefore it is some personal agent. It could choose between different assortments of predicates, and it could choose the ones that it wanted for the existence of our world instead of some other possible world. And so it didn't, again, flow like a logic problem here. All right, so those are the first three here that are just necessarily going to be implied by the necessary beings, just as ontology, the fact that he is a necessary being. Now, the last two here I'm going to be talking about according to theism, and these are often these attributes are often proved in other proofs. For example, the Aristotelian proof. Edward Feser, he talks about this one a lot. And basically, through a lot of Aristotelian metaphysics, you can show why God has to be simple, or why God has to be omnipotent. But here, I'm just going to say that, all right, according to theism, God is simple. All right, let's just say according to theism, God is simple. What that means is that he bears no external relations. He's not dependent on anything. He has no accidents or parts to him. He's not a composite, that is to say like a conglomeration of different individual things, but rather he is indivisible. He is one singularity. So the division between existence and essence does not apply to God. Existence for like a material object, like again this pen, precedes essence. Means the pen has to exist before it has any essence. It is not a predicate existence, but rather it's the instantiation of the object. For a pen to exist, it has to be instantiated. It is instantiation of the concept pen. However, God shares none of these relations. God does not share any relation between the existence, the predicate, and the object here. The predicates and the instantiation here. Also, God has no temporal becoming, so it doesn't make sense to say that existence would precede essence when it comes to God here. And so it can be concluded that God's essence contains existence. And this is something that people like Thomas Aquinas have all come to that conclusion. They're one and the same. It is entailed in his simplicity. And so if a necessary being we talked about, it has to have an internal explanation for its existence. It makes sense that this being is going to be God, since God's essence is one with his existence. And the reason why God exists is because that's part of the concept of God. And additionally, God is thought, and this is now, we're talking about like Anselm. I was kind of more of Aquinas, this is more now Anselm here. God is thought of as this greatest possible metaphysical being, or the most real being, as Kant thought of him as. He called him the ens realissimum, as to say it contains the most reality. Basically what that means, if you take any predicate, you can probably discern a positive predicate, or what we'll call like a greatness making property, and a negative property. And so you can have literacy and illiteracy being moral or immoral. So you have a positive predicate, a negative predicate. Now God is the summation of every possible, meaning in all possible worlds, you take all of the greatness making predicates and you can attribute them to God. And that's what we mean by when we say that God is the maximally greatest metaphysical being. Now imagine the greatest possible physical being you can think of. Just think of in your mind, close your eyes. Everyone close your eyes, all right? This is a audience interactive activity here, all right? So close your eyes. Think of the greatest possible metaphysical being. Now imagine if it didn't exist, all right? All right, so imagine if this greatest possible metaphysical being didn't exist. Then imagine if it did exist. All right, so imagine one side you have it doesn't exist. The other side it does exist. Which being is going to be more potent? Which is going to be more powerful? Obviously, the existing one. The existing being is, because as existence is a prerequisite to being great. If you're going to say that I am a rightist, have the greatness making property of being illiterate, let's just say that's the greatness making property, or this positive predicate of being illiterate, then I have to exist to have this property. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to say that I am in any sense have that property. And so existence, like I said, is going to be prerequisite to being great. So the concept of existence must be included in the attributes of God. Basically, again, his essence includes existence if he's a maximally great being. And again, so his nature, the definition of him being maximally great, seems to necessarily include the concept of existing. Otherwise, if he didn't exist, he would be less great as a being who did exist. Less potent, I guess is probably a good way to word it. And that seems to be more intuitively true. And there's a lot more I could get into there. There's a lot of debate and discussion. So I'll save that for another time. One of the things I didn't talk about here, but I'm just going to briefly talk about it, is like, what about if there's multiple necessary beings? Why is there only one? And suppose that there are two necessary beings who are extramundane. They are outside space, time, materiality. And the only way really we differentiate between objects is either their qualitative properties or their quantitative properties. So you can have two pens that are identical, same qualitative properties, but they're quantitatively different. They have different locations in space and time. Or between like this pen and this glasses case, we can differentiate them based by their qualitative properties. But if there is two necessary beings, they're going to have the exact same qualitative properties. And since they're outside space and time, there is no way to differentiate them in terms of their quantitative properties. So by the identity of what's called the indiscernibles, if x and y have all the same properties, then they are identical to one another. They are the same being. They're one and the same. So if there are two beings, they're really just the same. All right. Let's talk about some objections now. Alright, I see the chat is talking, but I will answer all of your guys' concerns at the end, I promise, guys. Believe me. But yeah, there's a lot to get through tonight. I'm sorry this is such a dense episode, but it had to be done, it had to be made. There has to be a rational basis for why I believe in God. And while you might, like, there might be little parts you can nitpick, and I've heard these arguments before, I think that it's just intuitively and most rationally, the evidence falls on the side that God does exist. And I'm kind of giving a a rational basis for that. I think it's very reasonable to say that God exists. And this is just one argument, by the way. There's not million, but there's a lot of arguments for the existence of God. So if you take all the arguments together, you can usually come up with a pretty solid case here. But anyway, what about the universe, which comes from quantum fluctuation? So this is something that Lawrence Krauss, and this is probably the worst objection I've ever heard. Like Lawrence Krauss, in his book, A Universe from Nothing, he basically says that there are these quantum fields, and that a quantum field that has no matter in it or no particles is unstable. And so if there was a universe with nothing in it, except for these quantum fields, then matter would have to pop into existence because it's unstable. And so even if something like, and it's called the relativistic quantum field theory, accurately depicted the creation of the universe ex nihilo, it doesn't explain where the laws of quantum mechanics arose from, nor why these set of laws exist instead of some other assortment of quantum laws. Lawrence Krauss even admits this himself at the end of the book, that there is no explanation for where the statistical distributions, which determine how the particle fluctuation behaves, really originates from. He just says, like, oh, they just always existed, or we have no explanation where they came from. So again, there has to be an explanation, and that explanation would have to be self-contained. That explanation is going to be God. Now, understanding nothingness, he says, a universe from nothing. Now, nothing is the absolute and universal negation of all positive predicates, including everything in existence, as well as abstract objects like numbers and concepts. This would include structures like quantum fluctuation. And so if we say universe from nothing, then that would mean there is no even quantum laws, nothing like that, is all still positive predicates. Lawrence Krauss holds that a universe coming from nothing is possible because a quantum fluctuation is unstable by itself, like I mentioned. However, if these laws of quantum mechanics exist, then this is not a universe from nothing. This is a universe from the laws of quantum mechanics. And so Lawrence Krauss was being just disingenuous here. And the only reason I bring this up is because I knew like there was some atheist guy who was going to argue this point. Otherwise, it's like the most brain-lit, like, way to try to get out of the existence of God I've ever heard of. The particular eternally persisting elementary physical stuff in the world, according to the standard presentation of relativistic quantum theory, consists of relativistic quantum fields, like I mentioned, and the fundamental laws of this theory take the form of rules concerning which arrangements of those fields are physically possible and which aren't, like I mentioned, and the rules connecting the arrangements of those fields at later times to the arrangements at earlier times, and so on. And so they say nothing about what kinds of matter exist as well. So the rules are basically just that. They're just rules on how these quantum fields fluctuate. They tell us nothing about what kind of matter has to pop into existence, or why that kind of matter would pop into existence. The same way the laws of gravity tell us how objects are going to interact, but the law of gravity doesn't tell me like that the Earth has to exist, or that what kind of objects are going to have to attract each other in terms of like the actual like composition, material composition, that they would be made of helium or hydrogen or something like that. So again, it doesn't explain why we have the material properties that we do, atoms, electrons, protons that we see in the world, quarks. Alright, so there's kind of like the response to that. Now, something that people have often asked about is like the multiverse objection. I feel like this one applies more to the Kalam cosmological argument, not so much mine. Of course, the multiverse is going to be able to say then that there is no start to the universe. They say that there's just like some field out there, and these universes are just popping in and out of existence. And basically, this is a really ad hoc theory. Like, there's no reason to think that that would be the case, unless, of course, you believe in what's called the chaotic inflationary model of cosmogony. And the chaotic inflationary model says that certain universes which are created, which are expanding, they'll be black holes. Excuse me. They'll be like black holes, which is to say there's like a tear in the space-time fabric. There's going to be a tear, and so out of that tear can pop new universes. So it looks kind of like this here, as you can see, little budding universes coming out of it. This is basically the current scientific model for what the multiverse could look like. If we were ever to discover the multiverse, it would have to look like something like this. Otherwise, you're just basically some ad hoc theory. And the only reason that I guess the multiverse would come up when talking about something like this is if someone said, oh, maybe in the multiverse there would exist something whose existence is self-contained that isn't God, but I don't see what that would be. Or maybe they would say that there's something that is unexplained in the multiverse, because the explanation of the universe, of course, then would come from the multiverse. And maybe the multiverse doesn't need an explanation. Which, again, the reason why we need explanations is because they're required for our epistemic knowledge. These are like internal regulatory principles to our reason. So they are not like really contingent on whether there's a multiverse or not. They're really contingent on whether or not we want to justify any of our knowledge, any of our beliefs. There has to be explanations. So I don't even think that would apply. But just going into it, I don't even think it proves what anyone would think it would prove, because the cosmogonic model that is currently being offered, the Born-Guth-Lanken theorem, states that any universe, which is on average expanding, has a beginning. And according to the inflational model of the universe, a multiverse starts off as a mother universe, which is expanding, and pops off these little smaller sub-universes, as I talked about. So the multiverse still has a beginning and requires an explanation. Still has a beginning. So even if, like, for people who believe in the Kalam cosmological argument, when she's talking about basically linear, a beginning of the temporal linear regress of the universe, they still require some cause or explanation there, which is very interesting. Honestly, I didn't really know about this until I started looking into a lot of these arguments. I think it reminds you of something like Horton Hears a Who. There's like a universe growing on like a dandelion. Or maybe even The Grinch, where there's a universe on like snowflakes. Each snowflake has a universe on it, so there's like mini universes within the universe. Something kind of like that. Anyway, but the problem, so there you have that. But then another big problem here is that what's called a Boltzmann brain. And basically, according to modern cosmological theory and the second law of thermodynamics, they stipulate that universe and the multiverses are going to have high entropy states, which means that the particles are disorganized and unfit to create life. Basically, in order to create life, there has to be this thermodynamic disequilibrium. There has to be low entropy states, meaning that they have to be very condensed and organized, the way that the particles are going to interact in order to create the necessary conditions for life. And the universe, of course, is going from a state of low entropy to high entropy. That's the law of second thermodynamics. And so basically, Robert Penrose, he calculated that the odds of our universe's initial low entropy conditions coming into existence, basically if you even have like a multi-universe and then, or any assortment of particles, and say how the probability basically that a lower entropy state that would be able to create the universe, considering how vast the universe is right now, how ginormous it is. It's like billions of light years in like circumference or whatever. It would take 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. And that is the odds that the universe is low entropy state, like that much basically organized particles could come and would be able to collect in like one spot to like infuse the Big Bang. Which means that the probability that a low entropy state formed at a smaller level, i.e. an individual mind with all the past memories built in it, is statistically more probable than a low entropy state, covering the distance of the entire universe. Basically, imagine like a tea kettle. The probability that just a tea kettle, forming from all these particles moving around in some low entropy state is higher than the probability, it's going to be more likely to happen than the probability of the entire universe coming together. And it seems it's even more likely that the brain could form, if a mind would form in this low entropy state. Basically, it's a mind, an individual mind with all the past memories built in it, what means that like my existence right now is basically some mind was just formed really quickly with all these memories, with all this information, and then the mind just vanishes out of existence. And so basically every past memory I just had, just what I said just a few seconds ago, even though it feels like I might just be conscious of what I just said a few seconds ago, it's possible it's just a past memory that my mind just came into existence at this very moment. And it's very much a reductio ad absurdum argument, because it's like no one would want to believe this. Just doesn't seem right at all. No one. This is like the most counterintuitive concept whatsoever. But it seems that given this multiverse model, that it's more likely that a brain could come together with all the past information than for it to like the entire universe to arise. And so even if such a mind were probable, then our universe, we could never trust any of our own thoughts, basically. Any thought I had, it could just very well be the case that it just is a past memory that's been fabricated, or any beliefs, in fact. And indeed, even our own scientific knowledge is basically undercut by this concept of the Boltzmann brain. And so, which of course is the very grounds upon which the multiverse hypothesis exists, upon which low entropy states exist. And so, Boltzmann brains basically cut against the very concept of the existence of the multiverse, which kind of, I guess you could say, is a defeater to the multiverse objection, just in general. All right, this is just kind of a sub point here. Why is it that science can't explain the origins of the universe, but philosophy can? And science can't explain it because a scientific method is something which is exerted, of course. The reason why we're able to discover things through science is we have, the scientific method, testing hypothesis, collecting data, yada, yada, yada. And this is something that's asserted and requires, of course, a justification outside of science. If we say that science can justify science, you have you're just engaging in circular reasoning, you're begging the question. So you have to offer something that's outside science, which of course is philosophy, which of course is epistemology, and of course is metaphysics. And science can of course shed light on the relations binding sensible objects that we see in reality, but science says nothing, and it cannot offer us a solid glimpse into the super sensible concepts like God. You cannot obviously experience God because he's immaterial, like we said. Something like the soul, you can't use like genetic science to talk about the soul. Our own freedom of will, volition, these are things that you can't observe. These are things that rather you experience. These are your metaphysical concepts in philosophy. And so these things are not reducible down to science. All right, last objection, and then I'm done. And that's, like I said, this eternalism. I said presentism. What I meant to say there was eternalism. Presentism is closer to the concept I'm basically espousing, but eternalism is this theory of time, and it's based now on special relativity, that the past, present, and future are all equally real. So like I said, when I said something exists implicit, meaning it exists in the present moment, well, what the eternalists believe is that everything existing in the past, present, and future are all equally real, and objects' existence is basically composed of what's called like a time worm. And so if you have this pen here, and let me just take off like the pen cap. So this here is like a part of the pen, this cap here, right? You see that? Yeah, just a part of the pen. It's a segment of the pen. The pen is physically extended in space. This is just a part of the pen. In that same way, the pen's temporal time point, as it exists right now in time, is just part of the pen. The pen's existence is really defined by its time point here, when it was over here, when it was over here, and over here, when it was laying on the table. And then it's all, of course, its existence extended forward in time, wherever that will be. And so in that forms what's called like this time worm, and that defines the existence of the pen. And people have often used this objection basically to state that the universe really doesn't have a beginning, because there's no really such thing as beginning. There's no temporal becoming whatsoever. And again, this doesn't apply to the Leibniz cosmological argument, because Leibniz cosmological argument is impartial about any theory of time. We're just talking about explanations and whether or not anything exists whatsoever. I've heard atheists try to use this before. The only thing it would really apply to is the eternal aspect of God. But I don't even think that holds. Because again, B theory is basically this very highly controversial theory in philosophy of time. And it presupposes a certain view of relativity, as of course Einstein's view of relativity, that isn't even universally recognized by scientists. Einstein himself in 1905 crafted special relativity around the A theory. A theory, of course, is past, present, future. And it wasn't until 1907 that Hermann Minkowski made time tenseless by creating space-time. That's what we mean by when we say that time is tenseless or space-time. And in the same way that space has no direction. There is no past or present or forward or backwards to space. Space is extended in all directions. There is no direction to time by combining space and time to explain relativity. Minkowski basically, created the theory of eternalism there. Or rather, the theory of eternalism relies on that concept. And so the B theory of time, which stipulates that the past is equally real as the present, relies on these Minkowski's equations. However, there are serious scientists who accept what's called like the Neo-Lorentzian equations, which are still very much compatible with the A theory of time. And both theories use the same data, they interpret them a little differently, but they are both internally consistent. So we have two theories, both are internally consistent. So the question is, which theory should we accept? And I say that our intuition, our conscious experiences, our language even, the way we have tensed languages, we talk about things having past, present, future tenses, they all presuppose a tensed reality. They all presuppose that time is as a linear trajectory forward. And that the present is when objects really do exist. And we can only really quantify over the present in our daily lives. Hence why many neuroscientists, in fact, actually reject the B theory. Neuroscientists look at the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we talk about our own selves, the way that we look at the world, and they say that there's no way that B theory can be real, just from our own daily experiences. One of the desiderata, or you could say like the requirements of any metaphysical theory, is its ability, to apply to our intuition, which of course B theory fails to do. And since B and A theory are both equally internally consistent, it seems that we should lean on the side of A theory, since like I said, our intuition matches that. There's also done experiments like the Bell's theorem and the EPR experiment. I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot of science in there, and I think you guys are probably losing, I'm starting to lose you guys here. Because there's a lot of like scientific jargon and whatnot, but basically that experiment definitely favors A theory, because B theory would require that objects are moving backwards in time, which would invert our concept of cause and effect. And of course also there's other philosophers like Tim Maudlin. He's been working on having space be directional. Instead of saying that space is not directionless, then time is going to be directionless by combining space and time. He said instead that space has a direction and that time has a direction. You combine those two. So the tensile theory, again, it makes it absolute. And of course, general relativity, it presupposes some general objective framework. General relativity in no way says that that the universe didn't have a beginning. That's not what it's saying. And again, this doesn't even matter because I didn't make any mention of time, temporal passage. It doesn't matter, regardless if we can quantify the past, present, or past, future. The principle of sufficient reason is still true. There still exists no eternal explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. It's only related to whether or not like the part about God being eternal. All right, I'm done, guys. I'm almost done. I know it's been an hour. You guys are probably losing patience here, but here's my concluding remarks. So, my presentation today was kind of an attempt to show that the epistemic probability for the existence of God is greater than any atheistic arguments which oppose his existence. Certainly, we cannot know anything with certainty. That is to say, with a subjective sense of certainty here. But I'll leave it up to you guys to decide which premises I think that you accept as like intuitive or reasonable, or rational, and whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. So yeah, thanks guys for watching. I'll now turn it over to you guys. Have any questions? Yeah, so thank you guys again for watching. Yes, that is the main takeaway here. It is reasonable. You're not an idiot. It is metaphysically very possible that God exists. And in fact, relying on certain metaphysical premises, it seems that God has to exist. And these are, of course, the premises that Leibniz has given, and even modern philosophers today hold to these premises. So hopefully I didn't rush through that too much. Hopefully I didn't speed through that, but I wanted to get through with everything in an hour. Just barely made it. So, all right, let me see what you guys are saying. Everything has already happened. What do you mean by that, dude? Yeah, so true, dude. Honestly, you are an idiot if you're an atheist. Because I think it's like a Gnostic. It makes a little more sense. why you may be indifferent to certain things, especially if you have a hard time choosing. Um, but atheist is basically saying that the epistemic probability that God doesn't exist is higher than he does, and that would require you to refute a lot of arguments. That you'd have to not only refute all the modern day arguments, contingency arguments like the ones I gave, but you'd have to go back and refute Berkeley's argument, Locke's argument, Kant's argument, all the versions of the ontological argument. And so this argument here is probably the strongest I've seen in terms of like the its elegance, in terms of the I guess you could say how intuitive the premises are. And so in that sense, I think this is definitely the strongest argument for the existence of God. But there's a lot of other good ones. Thomas Aquinas is Fourth Way is really good. There's good arguments that Augustine gave for why there has to be at least one, like a mind, one like a all-powerful mind. If you're interested in more arguments like these, check out definitely Ed Fazer's book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. You can also check out Joshua Rasmussen's paper in the philosophy of like theism journal, I think what it was. But just look up Joshua Rasmussen contingency argument, and there it is. It's very hard to read. There's actually Joshua Rasmussen presented like a lot more attributes of God, like why he thought God had to be all powerful. But it was so like difficult, and there's so much jargon there basically to wade through, that I decided it was just best not to like bring that up. If I tried to read that out loud, no one would be able to follow along. So I instead went with the Anselm route. Dumptrick says, I am a religious person, but I can't reconcile with the fact that I don't get to keep my wife in heaven. Should I start stocking up for Adrenochrome? Yeah, maybe you do, big guy. If you can't reconcile those two things, maybe you gotta try to live forever then, big guy. Because no wife in heaven, but you don't need it. That's the thing. In heaven, there is a symbiotic relationship between our actions and nature. So we are in a place, if you could say, eternal bliss, insofar as that when we act morally, that we are rewarded for that. Whereas currently, when you act morally, it's very possible bad things happen to you. Whereas in heaven, nature and our morality are synthesized. And of course, in heaven, we are perfect. We are with God. We are perfectly rational now. We have given up all the inclinations of the flesh. So that is why we will be, eternally rewarded. So you won't even need you, big guy. You'll be perfectly happy, perfectly fine. You'll experience eudaimonia, bro. Perfect contentment. You'll be good, dog. Trust me, heaven is what's to look forward to. Room Temperature says, if any of the boys like sci-fi, the movie Arrival happens in a universe with B-time theory. Really? Well, you should, I'm going to have to talk to the people who made the movie. I'm just kidding. Now, a lot of scientists actually do like B theory of time. I think a lot more scientists, a lot of them agree with it. Amongst philosophers, it's hotly contested. I think within philosophy of time, it's just like, I think it's like 60% believe in it. Whereas between like philosophers just in general, I think it's like 20%. Something like around there. It's very, very much debated upon. But like I said, I think the evidence for both A and B theory is going to be roughly the same. I think there's some things, new scientific experience, like the one I mentioned, that are going to bolster the A theory. And also I think our intuition matches the A theory. Which, if you don't have that necessary desiderata, your metaphysical theory suffers from problems. Thank you, Boneless Tony, for the lemon. Appreciate it, big guy. Thank you so much. Big shout out. Brother Pass and the roads in heaven are paved with gold because he used gold for time traveling. Is that right? I mean, gold is one of the most conductive metals, but I don't know how that is anything to do with time travel. Not gonna lie, maybe you can help me out with that one. Dumpdrink says, I already reached out to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She seems to manage staying alive with 2 cancer types. Must be good. Must need good adrenochrome. Yeah, she's definitely on adrenochrome, that's for sure. There's no way that she's able to be a Supreme Court justice and like at her age. Like I think she's like 80 something. When my great grandma was 80, she was like in a nursing home. She could barely get out of bed every morning. It was hard to have a conversation with her. So yeah, it's hard to imagine that they could keep that job. Has got the hookup. Dumb Trick does. Yes, I think I'll end the. It seems like the questions aren't particularly motivated by the topic tonight. That's okay. I enjoy these off-topic questions as well. I'll let those continue a little longer. I'll just stop the recording though, so the YouTube video doesn't go too long. So if you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate it. Hope you learned something new. If you have any questions, put them in the comment section below. And if there's a lot of questions, I'll do another video on it.